Greetings. My name is Sister Kathleen Duffy. I am the director of the Institute for Religion and Science at Chestnut Hill College and the president of the American Teilhard Association. I am pleased to welcome you to this lecture by Dr. Philip Hefner. This lecture is the first in a three-part series on robots and artificial intelligence, sponsored by both the Institute and the American Teilhard Association. I also invite you to join us on February 28th to hear Dr. Noreen Hertzfeld, who asks, "Alexa, do you love me?" And on March 21st, to hear Dr. Ann First, who asks, "Can AI systems be persons?" And now it is a joy, a great honor, and a real privilege to have Dr. Philip Hefner with us to open this three-part series, in which we are exploring our relationship as created human beings with our creations, artificial intelligence and robots. Phil will help us ponder and perhaps clarify the kinds of relationships that we are already developing with the amazing technologies that we, the created ones, have created, and those that are still possible for us. Dr. Philip Hefner is Professor Emeritus of Systematic Theology at the Lutheran School of Theology in Chicago, Illinois. An ordained minister of the Evangelical Lutheran Church, Phil has held several dozen visiting teaching and lecturing appointments at seminaries, colleges, and universities in the United States, Europe, Africa, and Asia. Much of Phil's scholarly work has focused on the interaction between science and religion. He is former editor of Zygon, the leading journal of religion and science in the world. He has published 6 books and over 150 scholarly articles. Phil helped to create the Chicago Center for Religion and Science, later named the Zygon Center for Religion and Science. He is a proponent of a field called religious naturalism and has been a member of the American Teilhard Association, so all the more that the Teilhard Association should co-sponsor this event. Phil is an inspiring lecturer. I particularly remember his lectures during the year when he was honored by the Metanexus Institute to be its first senior fellow. Now, because the recording of Phil's lecture began a few minutes into Phil's talk, I will read the first 2 pages of his paper, which should prepare you for the rest of the lecture. Artificial intelligence is becoming a vast field of research, giving us a rich theme for interpretation within the framework of Teilhard's thought. I will attempt to bring Teilhard's thought to bear on this paper, and I invite you to do the same. My main effort is to place AI theologically, to position it within a theological framework, specifically within my theological thinking of humans as God's created co-creators. Our technology began as tool-making, even when it turned to bioengineering and robotics. That is, it emerged and evolved to perform tasks for us. Recent developments suggest that it is entering a phase in which it is on its way to creating creatures that are in fact functioning life and functioning human life. With its science and technology, the created co-creator is embarking on the challenge of creating its own co-creator. I use the term creating life to refer to both biological and non-biological forms. As we progressed in creating ever more marvelous tools, we discovered that we desire tools to perform tasks that require human or nearly human capabilities. We are learning that the challenge is therefore to create creatures who are functioning humans or nearly functioning humans. In the realm of biology, we have attempted with some success to create biologically living creatures. But we have become even more successful in recreating ourselves through biological means. Genetic engineering and CRISPR are examples. By editing the human genome, CRISPR techniques rewrite the human code and in this sense create new living creatures. At an earlier stage, research on embryos did the same. An embryo with an altered gene became, in fact, a different creature from the embryo with unaltered genes. Our science and technology had already mastered the task of manipulating animal and plant forms that are, in fact, created living things. Now that we are altering human forms, we are, in fact, creating living humans. In order to guide our genetic engineering and CRISPR activity, we must ask, what does it mean to be human? Does our definition of the human, for example, include freedom from all genetically based disease? We touch here on the issue of human enhancement and transhumanism. And does our concept of the human include extending longevity as far as possible? Or enhancing human bodies and intelligence and skills? For all practical purposes, we are at present answering all these questions with a yes. We may demur when the questions are put to us directly. Transhumanism is scoffed at in many circles, but our behavior for all practical purposes affirms the transhumanist program. Robots and artificial intelligence raise similar issues. I include these in the term creating functioning human life for the following reason. With the advent of AI, we envision robots that can perform human tasks, explore extraterrestrial environments, serve and care for humans and be their companions, as well as to enhance industrial procedures and serve military purposes. The more perfectly the robots serve human needs, especially care and companionship, the more like humans they will become. It is important to my argument to emphasize that robots are in fact not human, and they never will be, but they can be developed in ways that function like humans. The comparison then is between human beings and functional humans. Human intelligence is the measure of robot creation, even though robots will never be human. And now I turn the lecture over to Phil to finish his lecture. Thank you.
And when we create these AI robots, we measure them by human intelligence, artificial intelligence measured by human intelligence. Now, our artificial intelligence is not anywhere near approaching the human. We are not creating artificial intelligence human beings, but we're measuring them by humans so that we measure their performance by whether or not it approaches the human ability. And I think that's very important. And of course, the closer that they get to doing what we want them to do, the closer they get to being like us in some respects. And that's what I call functioning life. It's very important that the standard that we use when we make AI robots is human intelligence. That is the measure. I think it's important to try to understand why I call it functioning life, not actual human life, but functioning life. The more that the AI robots approach human performance, you can think of all the things that robots do, whether it's playing chess, whether it's waging war, whether it's doing other things like serving in restaurants. My part of Chicago now is opening a restaurant. It'll be the first restaurant that will have robots delivering food. That'll be a new experience. The more that these robots approach us, the more they become functioning human life. I have formulated a general principle which says basically that. And the more the robots approach our capabilities, the more we can say that we are creating our own co-creator. Not so much has been done with this in religion or theology, not really all that much in philosophy. But novelists, some of them science fiction writers, others aren't, have done a great deal with this issue of functioning life. If you're familiar with Marge Piercy's novel, He, She, It, you'll know about this. If you like the Blade Runner movies, you know, they are gripping movies that approach this theme directly. Those of you who know those movies realize that the artificial intelligence robots in the movie have attained a close enough approximation to the human that they understand their own mortality. They were built to self-destruct after a certain number of years. And when they realize that they're very upset, and the movie spends a lot of time on their search for the designer who designed them. And when they finally get him cornered and tell him that they don't want to self-destruct, he says that it's impossible to change the programming. Some of you may have read Kazuo Ishiguro's new novel called Clara. It's a very interesting novel. Clara is a companion robot. And the novel has to do with Clara's being a companion to a teenage girl. And Clara ends up in the junkyard for old, unused, useless robots. Companion robots are a very important thing. You know, if you go, we have to realize that artificial intelligence and robots are all around us. I have artificial intelligence on my TV. When I ask Alexa to tune to a certain channel for me, she does that. If I tell her I want music on a certain theme, she finds the music for me. It's in our smartphones. Many people have it in their appliances so that they can talk to Alexa and turn the stove on or change the the thermostat. And if you go to Amazon, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here, but if you go on Amazon and you Google companion robots, you will be amazed at how many you find in the Amazon selection. Many of them between $250 and $750. One of them is named Buddy because it's a companion to children. They do all sorts of household tasks. And it is the case today that billions of dollars are being put into AI robot research by the federal government, by academic institutions, and by industry. And in fact, one thing that President Trump did in 2017 was to establish the Select Committee for artificial intelligence. And they formulated, it's a very interesting document to find on, you can Google it. And among other things, it has a very sketchy ethics section. It's not very profound, but at least they started to work on the ethics of it. AI, of course, plays a very an increasingly large role in medicine. Medical schools and medical centers are very alert to the possibilities for AI, and it also can be used in warfare, in guiding the drones that carry out so many terrible things and assassinating people, and other ways that it's used. So, as I move into the philosophical and theological reflection on this, I'm very impressed by what I call the proportionality between God, humans, robots, and robots, humans, God. You know, we speak of ourselves as carrying out God's work. The Jewish concept of mitzvot is that by doing the mitzvot, by carrying out the commands of law, Jews are actually extending the presence of God in the world. My denomination has a motto that it uses called God's work, our hands. We talk quite a bit about us doing God's work. Do we think that we are God? No. We may not even like the word godlike, but we may understand that we believe we are functioning as God would function in the world. And we talk about Christians talk about loving other people as Christ loves us. Very much an extension there, but we are not God, we are not godlike, but we are functioning in a sense, have to be careful here, functioning like God in the world. So it's not so unusual to think that we create AI robots that increasingly function like us in the world. Now, we're a long ways from that. There's no AI robot that comes anywhere close to human capabilities, but it is still the standard, the measure, or the goal in our creating these robots. I think there's another interesting point about this creating AI robots. You know, Mircea Eliade, the great religious scholar of world religions, has some very interesting things to say that when humans create things, they are mimicking God. That plays out in quite a few of our customs, you know. In some parts of the world, houses are built in a certain way to be reminiscent of the kingdom of heaven. Often in the older days, I don't see it so much now, when we built tall buildings, we topped them off with a quasi-religious ceremony. In my mind, there is no question but the fact that in our creating AI robots, we are mimicking the creative work of God. Now, this can be very dangerous. It can be arrogant. It can be full of hubris. And of course, what we do with our creations, including our AI robots, can be all of those things. But it also can have the intention to be good, to do good things, to do God-like things in the world. And I think that's an important part of AI robots research too. Its use in medical centers, for example, is for the benefit of people. Its use in drones on the battlefield is to kill people. It can be hubris and very dangerous, or it can be a beautiful, creative work that seeks to be obedient to God. I think that when we, and this is really my final point, I think that when we create these AI robots, we're into what I call deep creating. We're not just creating casually, but deep creating. And in that creating, we actually encounter God. And we have to ask questions, theological questions. People often don't consider them theological. But for example, in the use in medicine, we come up against the question, what is the point of healing? What is the purpose of healing? It's to improve the quality of life and longevity. Is this really what God has created us to do, to live as long as possible? Questions like this come up when we ask the purpose. And the same with the drones. Is it really a proper thing for us to do, to be creating AI robots that make it easier to kill people and to destroy villages and cities? These are the kinds of moral and ethical questions that the government committee, select committee, doesn't raise, although they do raise the question of doing harm. Well, I think at bottom, these turn out to be religious questions. And the more sensitive we are, not just technophiliacs, people who love technology for the bigger and the better. If it's more complex, that's great. But who actually are reflective about it, and I think that's one of the big challenges. We'll get this religious dimension. Now, I want to point out 5 elements of Teilhard's thought that are very relevant, I think, here. First of all, Teilhard, and sometimes this has been quite controversial, he considered technology to be a phase of the evolutionary process. He did not make this dualism between nature and technology. Is it natural food or is it genetically enhanced food? He included both of those in the evolutionary process. And I happen to think that that's a very profound insight. The world that human beings live in today is so conditioned by technology. All of the Earth's surface, all of the Earth's living creatures are impacted by our technology. And that becomes the nature that we live in. Technology, I would argue, could be understood as the nature that humans have created. Teilhard, secondly, wanted to make it clear that we are part of this evolution. You know, the phenomenon of man, his great work, placed man in human beings in the evolutionary framework. And of course, his fundamental principle was that of complexity consciousness. He thought that there was a directionality in evolution, and that this directionality was towards complexity, and the complexity enhanced consciousness. I think that's very clear in AI robots. They are incredibly complex. And this is one of the big questions that's asked. They are approaching a kind of consciousness, which I think could be analyzed within that Teilhardian framework very well. He also believed that evolution is being pulled toward the Christ Omega. In other words, every stage of evolution, and I would say including AI robots, brings about a new dimension of reality. He was very strong on this, that he said that technology had created a spiral fabric around the planet so that the whole planet was technologized. I think that's very easy to understand today with all of our technology and all of the dependence we have on satellites that enhance our communications and that. He, of course, believed that there was progress in evolution, and the major element of the progress was that it was God pulling us towards Christ Omega. And then finally, the whole process for Teilhard was a process of love. And I think that's very challenging to us as we reflect on AI robots. They can be very definitely part of our desire to act in loving ways. They can also be just the opposite. I think that Teilhardian principle would be very useful for reflecting on AI robots. Well, I hope this gives you something to think about. I hope you have lots of questions. I'll bring it to an end now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Philip. That was very, very interesting. I've been thinking myself a lot about AI lately, and this was just what I was hoping to hear about. Now, I think, am I right, Sister Kathy, we're going to move toward breakout rooms?
I will be sending you into cyberspace, and you will land in a room with about 6 people. Please have a good conversation. In 15 minutes, we'll return and we can engage Phil in all kinds of questions and ideas. See you in a bit.
All right, everybody's back. It's glad to see you all. I just had a wonderful talk with 6 people in my chat. Are there any major ideas that emerged from your chat, particularly questions or ideas that you think might be interesting to bounce off of Phil?
And I would ask that people put them in the chat, so that lets us kind of
write the question, and then we can, collect them and try to get as many answered.
Maybe while we're waiting for people to put things in the chat, I'll ask the first question of Phil. So you mentioned the science fiction and fantasy as a way of exploring these issues, and I was wondering if you wanted to talk a little bit about what you feel they bring that perhaps the philosophies don't bring.
Well, of course, they can be philosophically laden. Well, first of all, they bring in so much interesting detail. When you're writing a novel, you depict the characters, you go into quite a bit of detail. Some of it's suggestive and some of it's very explicit. And the interest for me is in those details. For example, the details of the replicants in Blade Runner. You know, that's so absolutely fascinating. If you wanted to deal with that in a discursive, philosophical, or theological work, it wouldn't be nearly as interesting. And of course, novelists, artists have a lot of imagination. And for example, one of the most interesting things for me in Blade Runner is that they replicate emotions. So you remember the one replicant, the woman, actually has been programmed with the emotions of another person. And so her emotional reactions are very authentic, but they're not hers. Well, I think that's very, very relevant to companion robots, because, you know, whether it's companion robots for old people or children or sick people, they're trying to, if you look at the advertisements for them, they're building in empathy. Well, of course, how would you build in empathy? That's an interesting question. And I think the artists get into those issues so interestingly and in so much detail.
Yeah, well, thank you. So we have a bunch of questions have now popped up in the chat, and maybe I'll pull one out, which is where or what do you think is the boundary between artificial intelligence and consciousness?
Well, I think that's a very difficult and maybe misleading kind of question. You know, there's so much philosophical writing about consciousness, the philosophy of mind. If you get into that, it's very easy to get lost in the morass of all of that. And of course, you have to have criteria. So what would be your criterion for recognizing consciousness? And what would be your criterion for assessing whether or not a robot had it? I think that question actually is not really worth asking, because it'll end up in an endless discussion. I think that's why I like to use functional categories. Does the robot function like the human being in whatever activity you're talking about? Does it play chess like a human? Well, no, they don't play chess like a human, but they play very good chess. So that's why I use functioning. I like that category, because I don't think the question of those criteria could ever be agreed on. And every thinker is going to have a different criterion, or a slightly different criterion.
Thanks. There are a lot of people were dancing around that question in the chat. Someone would also like to know, Ralph Martinez wants to know, can AI help humanity solve the ecological crisis?
Well, however the crisis is defined, yes, I would think so. It would be a handy resource. And of course, probably in such areas as gathering data, there's probably quite a bit of AI being used now. And of course, environmental issues have lots of data that have to be dealt with. And yeah, I don't know how exactly, but I would think very definitely it's going to be. And I bet that if we had an ecologist, a professional ecologist in the audience, they would be able to tell us about that.
Yeah, I mean, those are clearly our big problems facing us. So Dan wonders, can robots bring about brand new life forms? It seems that AI can't produce things that did not exist before.
Well, I think that all depends what you mean by it. You know, the critical thing about AI now is, in its highest developments, is that it's not operating simply on the basis of pre-programmed information. You know, like Big Blue that played chess. They input all of this information so that Big Blue could think very fast and put it all together. But artificial intelligence today makes its own decisions, in a sense. Do you remember when we put the probe for Mars on the planet on Mars? There was a certain gap where the artificial intelligence in the space vehicle had to make its own decisions, because it took so long for the signal to get back to Earth that they couldn't just set a signal up and have the vehicle respond to it. There were more steps in between there. And I don't know a lot about that, but I think that's extremely important. And that's what makes AI so interesting. That AI doesn't just respond to programming. It is designed in a way that it can make some of its own decisions.
This is pretty
I'm
cool.
putting that very, very crudely, but I think that's the heart of it.
Yeah. Seraphim wonders, where does AI fit in the intersection between intelligence, which is problem solving, and wisdom, which identifies the problem and discerns which are actually human problems and which are just delusions of our appetites?
Yeah, that's the big question, isn't it? The relationship between intelligence and wisdom. Yeah. Well, that's a question we have to probe. By the way, I wanted to give an example of AI. You know, I have AI in my smartphone, of course. And since my vision is deteriorating, I do a lot of voice recognition. And I've noticed one really interesting thing. And I sign my messages Phil. And voice recognition always spells that F-I-L-L. When I turn off the microphone, it automatically changes it to P-H-I-L. I'd like to know what it is, and I think it has something to do with AI. I wonder what it is in my cell phone that self-corrects after I turn the microphone off. That's a fascinating thing to me. But that shows you how common AI is. I mean, if you've got a smartphone, you've got quite a little bit of AI in there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And maybe the last question, which is several people are asking it in different ways, is not just about is AI conscious, but is also is a robot conscious? Does life equal consciousness? How would you define life? Which is a huge question.
Yeah. Well, see, that now you're discovering my style. I don't, there are certain questions that I've decided are never going to be resolved. And so I don't spend a lot of time on them. And you've hit two of them. Of course, of course, robots are not living. But if they function like living creatures, what's the line between them being just machines and behaving so much like humans that they're human-like. And the same with consciousness. But I think, you know, if Patrick's a philosopher, he can say more about consciousness and the philosophy of mind. But I think that we do so much in science and technology on function. And you know, the old Chinese room puzzle and the Turing test. At what point can you say that a computer is thinking like a human? Well, you don't really know. So you put them in a room with a curtain over it, and you ask the question, are they answering these questions like a human would answer them? And if they are, then you say, de facto, that's functioning consciousness. De facto, that's functioning human. Of course, they're not humans. And I think that's a fascinating thing about AI that is taking us some leaps forward. It is raising that question of the functioning becoming so important and so close to what the humans can do. And of course, if you have robots on the battlefield, not just drones, you know, they're going off and doing a lot of things that are human-like. So the terms godlike and human-like are very important for me, and also the term functioning as God and functioning as humans.
Mhm, mhm.
Yeah. A couple of people have weighed in with about how the voice recognition works. So
Oh, good. Tell me.
So repetitive algorithms trigger the corrections. You correct it and it learns what you've corrected. And the voice recognition autocorrect is reacting to your voice, but when you turn the mic off, then it's drawing from its memory.
Okay.
Mhm.
See, that's a lot more complicated than I would think of when I hold my phone in my hand.
Right. I agree. And I think here's our last question for the night is, can AI love?
Oh, that's the question that comes up in the novel Clara. Well, I guess the way you'd have to put it is, can the robot behave in loving ways? And the answer is yes. Can the robot love? You know, I doubt it. These are all bringing up the same kinds of issues, aren't they?
Mhm.
It's functioning as if in a loving way, but is the emotionality of love in a companion robot? Well, of course not. And in Clara, but she certainly has the algorithms and what goes along with that to produce loving behavior towards this teenage girl that she's the companion to.
Yep.
If you Google some of these AI robots, there's one called Sophia. And at the time that I wrote this, a year and a half ago, Sophia was considered to be the most sophisticated robot in existence. She's been interviewed on TV. She has South African citizenship, all sorts of strange things there. And of course, the whole panoply of emotions she can deal with. But is she loving? Is she conscious? You know, I think that's highly unlikely. Is she a human? I mean, to become a citizen, you'd think you have to be a human. No, she isn't. But she certainly is behaving in ways that are almost equivalent. But we do have to say we're a long ways though from robots being human. We're a long way. But there's so much research. There's so many researchers working on this, and they're pouring so many billions of dollars into the research that naturally they're going to make progress.
Yep, I think there's been a tremendous amount of progress just in my lifetime, and I wonder what it will look like over the next decade. I'm going to turn this back to Patrick.
Okay.
Which I think I can do.
All right. Thank you, everybody, for, I think we had over 45, maybe even approaching 50 attendees today. I just want to say thank you to everyone for taking the time to come to our presentation and to see Phil speak. The entire board works very hard to try to find just the right speakers every year. And but the whole thing depends on all of you showing up, and our move to Zoom has really allowed us to expand the people who are able to participate, and we're really thinking this is a good fit for us. Wouldn't you say that's true, Sister
That's
Kathy?
true. I think
Yeah.
so.
Also, I would like to remind everyone that this is part one of a three-part series of events. So 2 and 3 are still to come. So if you haven't got onto the mailing list or the email list, make sure you go to the website and do that, and then you can make sure that you are reminded about when these new the second 2 events in the series will come up. All right, Sister Kathy, is there anything else that I should mention?
Just to thank Phil for coming to being with us. And I'm just thrilled, and I'm so happy to see all of you who came to and listen. But thank you, Phil, for your insight. It's very, very interesting perspective on all of this. I think everybody knows a little bit about.
Well, thank you very much. I really enjoyed it.
Good.
I wish I could answer all those questions, but that's the way it goes. You didn't talk to us about philosophy of mind, Patrick.
Well,
And they're still coming. The comments are still coming.
I don't think I'm on the dock.
Chat when we're finished. So thanks again. Have a wonderful evening, and do come to the next 2 events. I think you'll enjoy them. All right.
Thank you, everybody.
Good night.
Good night.